Seif Aleph. Gimmel Tammuz. What's Gimmel Tammuz? Hayom shebo yatsa choik merichami admor lecherus mibeis ha'asurim. The day that my father-in-law, the Frierdiker Rebbe, came out, was freed from prison. And the Rebbe says, this day, Gimmel Tammuz, chal bekama shonim besmichas l'Shabbos parshas Chukas. Many years it comes in close proximity to Shabbos parshas Chukas. Pa'amim shechal hashavua shel parshas Chukas. Sometimes it's actually that parsha. Ulefamim biyamim hamizborchim mishabbos parshas Chukas, and sometimes it comes after parshas Chukas in the days that are blessed by parshas Chukas. Valpi divrei hashalah hayeduim, and this is something that the Rebbe cites in many, many sichos, that based on the very famous words of the Shalah, shekol moyedei hashana koilel moyedim derabanan, that all the holidays of the year, inclusive of those that were established by the Chachamim, nirmazim beparshias haTorah shekorim b'shabbos shehem chalam behem. They are alluded to in the parshias of the Torah that are read on the Shabbos, that includes that important days. So move on. So based on this teaching of the Shalah, it's understood sheyeshnei remez beparshas Chukas al hageula de Gimmel Tammuz, that there has to be an allusion in Parshas Chukas to the day, to the happenings of what happened on Gimmel Tammuz. And note that the Rebbe is including in the Moyadim Dirabanan also the Yemei de Pagra, the special days that were established as Yom Tovim in Chabad based on what happened to Arabeim. Base. B'Geulas Choik Marichami Admor, Haya Beis Shlavim Kloliim. So in the Geula, in the redemption of my father-in-law, the Rebbe, there were two general eras. There were two general stages. The Gimmel Tammuz Yatsa Mibeis Hasurim. On Gimmel Tammuz, yes, he did leave prison. Aval oz nishlach legolos lemeshach Gimmel Shanim. But then he was commuted to exile for 3 years. Rak la'achar mikain, but after that, b'yud beis yud Gimmel Tammuz yatsa lecheres ba'ofen muchlat. But then, instead of it being 3 years, first it was supposed to be actually 10 years, then it was whittled down to 3 years, and then, miraculously, after only 10 days, on Yud Beis Yud Gimmel Tammuz, he went out definitively to freedom. Gam min hashiluach legolos, v'hutar lo lashuv leveisai. He was freed even from having to be exiled from his home into Golos, and he was freed to go back home. So what we find here, v'nimtza, shebegimel Tammuz hoisa hascholas hageula, or be'ybeis Gimel Tammuz hoisa shleimas hageula. So we have the beginning of the Geula is on Gimmel Tammuz, and the end is on Yud Beis Yud Gimel. And because it is the beginning, there is something of an advantage in Gimmel Tammuz vis-a-vis Yud Beis Yud Gimel. The Rebbe explains, although when we celebrate the holiday of the redemption was fixed for Yud Beis Yud Gimel Tammuz, Dafka specifically. And the Rebbe explains why. Hine tama davar hu lefi shehazman hara'ui lekfias inyan shel chag v'simcha geluya hu kasher hageula hi b'shleimus. The Rebbe explains that the reason that was said to be the day that we commemorate his freedom is because it is appropriate to celebrate when you have the fruition and the completion of the Geula. And in the brackets, the Rebbe draws a parallel. He says, "Al derech birchas hagoimel." It's like, when do you say the bracha hagoimel? Shebera choik merichami admor rak achar hageula b'yud beis Tammuz. The Frierdiker Rebbe only said the bracha hagoimel after Yud Beis Tammuz. Lefi she'ein levarach at sheyatza mehasakana legamrei at sheyachzor levoirav legamrei. Here the Rebbe is quoting the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, that when do you say hagoimel? Let's say you had an operation. You don't say hagoimel when you come out of the hospital. You say hagoimel when you are completely recovered. Okay? So in like fashion, the holiday for commemorating the redemption was set for Yud Beis Yud Gimmel when it's the completion. Avol be'etzem inyan hageula. Okay? So if you look back, you could see that earlier the Rebbe underscored the word chag. If you're talking about the Chag, when you should celebrate, then that's appropriate to do on Yud Beis Yud Gimel Tammuz. But if you're focusing on the Geula, the actual redemption, Yeshnai Ilui Bahascholas HaGeula Legabe Shleimas HaGeula, then from that perspective, there is an advantage to the beginning of the Geula juxtaposed against its fruition, its completion. In addition to the fact that there's something about that first stage breaking through the difficulty, like we have the famous teaching, Kol Haschalas Kashes. All beginnings are very difficult because the beginning means you have to forge the path. You have to shatter the ceiling. You have to create a new situation, a new reality. Doesn't mean there are not going to be difficulties afterwards, but the greatest difficulty is to create that paradigm shift. So in addition to this, the Rebbe says, Hine b'hascholas ha'geula nifal shinui hamatzah v'ad lahafroi migolos goyla l'geula. But in addition to the fact that all beginnings are difficult, and the beginning was on Gimmel, but the Rebbe says, but really the change from goyla l'geula, the transformation from being imprisoned to being freed, that happened on Gimmel. Ubefrat, in brackets now, and specifically Benidun Didan, in what we are talking about right now. Sheyeshna hamatzav bepashtos shenifal al-yidei ha'geula begimel Tammuz ha'shichrur mibeis hasurim ubefrat b'tznoim shehayu b'medina hi b'yam mahem ha'mavar afilu l'matzav shel golas b'iracheka. The Rebbe says, especially when we're talking about what happened to the Frierdiker Rebbe, his being freed from a prison, considering what the conditions were in prisons in those days, and then being and that being transformed, that changing to his being exiled, even being exiled in a very far away place. Hayabakama pratim. In many respects, this was Gadol Yoser. This was a much greater transformation. Min hashinui v'hachiluk shebein hayoser b'goyla levein yitziasei chafshi leveisei. From this was much bigger than what would happen afterwards. That he was commuted to going into exile, and later he would be freed from that. Ubefrat shegam acher kach b'yoser b'veisei hayoser tachas hashgacha mitzad hamemshalahi. And especially because even after he came home, he was still being watched. So he was still under some type of house arrest. Hashgacha, the Rebbe is saying in quotations. Bahare Yadua, and it's known, Shabaschalas kol inyan, that at the beginning of everything, Nichlal hadavar kulai. Everything is already encapsulated. Everything is already included in the very beginning. Al derech shematinu be'inyan de Rashi Tevis, like we find with the whole concept of Rashi Tevis, of an acrostic. And Rashi Tevis is not just something cute. It's inyan al pi Torah v'gam bit Torah. It is a way of learning Torah, and it's also found in Torah. Sha'ois harishona shel hateva miramezes al kol hateva. That the first letter of a word alludes to it contains within it the entire word. Ukedaima and likewise. Val derech ze b'inyanenu. And so it is with what we are studying now. Shakol gulasai shel choik Mori Chami Admor nirmiza v'nichlala b'haskalas ha'geula b'Gimmel Tammuz. That the whole geula of the Frierdiker Rebbe is alluded to and is contained in the beginning, which happened on Gimmel Tammuz. Gimmel. Teichnam haklali shel maser geulas choik Mori Chami Admor kashur la'avaydasai b'harbatzas haTorah v'hachzakas hayadus v'hafatzasam b'medina hahi. The whole reason for the imprisonment and later the freedom of the Frierdiker Rebbe, it's all connected to his work in promulgating Torah, in strengthening the infrastructure of Judaism, and in spreading and growing the infrastructure of Judaism in that country. Avoida shedarsha b'yamim ahem mesiras nefesh b'poyel. And this was work that necessitated self-sacrifice. B'poyel, practically. Everything about this work was self-sacrifice. V'yaseramizu, and even more. As has already been explained a number of times, Loi haisazu mesiras nefesh ba'alma. This was not pedestrian self-sacrifice. Ela mesiras nefesh bili hagbalos v'cheshbonos. This was self-sacrifice with, with no parameters, and there were no cheshbonos. This wasn't premeditated. This wasn't calculated. It was untrammeled mesiras nefesh. Ilu haya nichnas lecheshbon im yeshnam drachim al piteva lahatzliach ba'avoda kazu yetz bazeh. If he would have, or anybody would go into ruminating and calculating and analyzing if there is any way to actually have success in this work, there would be no place in seichel, in logic, to engage in this kind of work. And how much more so not to literally give up your life for this. Or because and how much more so, and how much more so, and how much more so not to put his students and his shluchim in danger for this work. There would have been no place al biseichel to engage in this. And I just want to hasten to add that there are other places the Rebbe explains, because it's a very big question. How could the Frierdiker Rebbe? It's one thing you want to have mesiras nefesh, but how could you endanger your students, your shluchim, other people? And the Rebbe explains there that there's no daylight, there's no difference, there's no space between the Frierdiker Rebbe and his shluchim. And we understand the same thing for the Rebbe. It wasn't that he was endangering them; he was endangering himself. And on this note of that, there would be, like, if you applied logic to this, you would have just come away saying, this doesn't make any sense. Let's move on and do something that makes more sense. And Rebbe Naomi Futterfass related that, the famous story that the Frierdiker Rebbe made a covenant with 10 of his Hasidim. And the one that was put in charge of opening and maintaining mikvahs at that time in Russia. And they asked the Frierdiker Rebbe, like, how can you put this person in charge of this? He's going to be caught, and he could be killed, and best case scenario, he'll be farshikt, he'll be exiled, who knows for how many years. And that as soon as we open up a mikveh, the Soviets will just dump a whole bunch of cement into it, and that'll be the end of all the hard work. And the Frierdiker Rebbe said that if one woman goes to the mikveh one time, it's all worth it. One woman, one time. So this modality of self-sacrifice, without any calculations, Ra'inu etzel chayk Merichami Admor begoloi, b'hanagosoi hanal bechlal, ubefrat b'kesher im gulase begimel Tammuz. So this was the Frierdiker Rebbe's modality. This was his MO in general, and specifically when it came to the events surrounding Gimmel Tammuz. Ad she'etzem hatarich de Gimmel Tammuz b'shaychas legeula, mitzayin es mesiras nafshay kedel kaman. As we're soon going to see, based on what the Rebbe is going to teach us here, we're going to see that the very date Gimmel Tammuz underscores his Mesiras Nefesh. The Slonim might say, "She'inyan zeh sha'geula de Gimmel Tammuz ha'isa shayeches l'darga zu de Mesiras Nefesh." We might say that this concept, that the geula of Gimmel Tammuz is connected to this highest level of Mesiras Nefesh, l'loy kol hagbalas de cheshbon, without any parameters and without any calculations at all. The reason that this level of Mesiras Nefesh has to be showcased in the Geula of Gimel Cheshbon, we might say that's because in the beginning of the Geula, there already has to be expressed the central theme of why the Frierdiker Rebbe was put into Golos in the first place. Dalit. Because the beginning, like the Rebbe says, has to encapsulate everything. Dalit. Harebe Baal HaGeula B'Hasimcha Siper. The Frierdiker Rebbe, who's the Baal HaGeula, the Baal HaSimcha of Gimel Tammuz, told, Shebiyoim Hei, Rosh Chodesh Tammuz, Koidem Chatzos Hayom, that on Rosh Chodesh Tammuz, it was a Thursday, before noon, Masru Loyes Hayediyah, Shehu Yishuchra Mibeis Ha'asurim, V'yishlach Legolos Legimel Shonim Be'er Kastrama. So on Rosh Chodesh Tammuz, it was a Thursday. He was in the morning. He was already notified that he was going to be freed and he was going to be sent to the city called Kastrama for 3 years. And at the same time, they informed him that he's going to be freed during the day. V'yutar loy, and they're going to permit him lishais b'mechitzas b'nei beisi lemeshach vav sha'is. They're going to free him, and they're going to allow him 6 hours to spend with his family. Ubalayla, and that night, yeh olav lazev v'seir v'lensoy lekastrama. And after 6 hours, he's going to have to leave his city, and he is going to travel to Kastrama. Now, because this was on a Thursday, Sha'al HaRebbe, so the Rebbe asked, Masa Yagil Kastrama. How long does it take? When am I going to arrive at Kastrama? Ve'yeshiva and they replied to him, Sheyagia l'sham b'Shabbos. They told him that he's going to arrive on Shabbos. Al kach amar Rebbe, so the Rebbe answered, Sheb'Shabbos b'shum oifen lo yisa. On Shabbos, he's not traveling. There's no way. ורק לאחר השתדלות מיוחדת בקרב חוגי הממשלה פעלו שיוכל הרבי לנסוע ביום א' ג' תמוז ועד אז נשאר בבית המייסר. And after a tremendous amount of machinations on the part of people who brought pressure on the government, they allowed the Frierdiker Rebbe to remain in prison until Sunday, Gimel Tammuz, and then he traveled to Kastrama. Echad me'elu shebitzu bepoel es ma'asare. Amarle, one of the people who actually executed his imprisonment, okay? So one of the people that was involved in imprisoning the Frierdiker Rebbe said to him, She'im lo yaskim l'tzoye bolel, shishi ulagila kastrama b'Shabbos lo yushcherar min ha'maser. One of those involved in imprisoning him told him, if you're going to act like this, and you're going to be so obstinate, and you're not going to leave now, you're not getting out of prison altogether. Al kach heshiv lo haRebbe, the Rebbe answered to him, Shemuchan hu lishar b'masar kol meshech zman shiyeh, aval b'Shabbos b'shum oifen lo yisa. Frierdiker Rebbe answered, I'm ready to stay in prison as long as I have to stay, but on Shabbos, I'm not traveling. Hey. So now the Rebbe analyzes this. He says, Hanhaga kazu, la moid be toikif kazeh, shaloi linsei b'Shabbos dereshet hasbara. This kind of behavior, to be this obstinate about not traveling on Shabbos, demands explanation. B'kach shesiriv l'malis hatzibur linsei miyad l'kastroma la'achar shekvar huskam l'shachrirai b'hemaiser v'nishar b'masar hemit harebi es atzmi miyad b'matzav shel vadai sakana. By refusing to fulfill this command, basically, that he travel immediately to Kostroma. And this was after they had already agreed to free him from prison. So by remaining in prison, the Rebbe put himself into immediate and definite danger. Okay? This was not ambiguous, and this was not something that might happen. He placed himself in immediate and definite danger. Now, milachatchila, hare nigzar alav gzar din shel hefach hachayim rachmal atzlan. In the beginning, he was commuted to death. Ella she'al yedei yishtadlus butla hagzera v'huchlefa ba'einish kal yoser shel eser shanim v'acher kach Gimmel shanim begolos. But through tremendous efforts, death penalty was rescinded, and it was changed to a much easier punishment, and that is that he should be exiled for 10 years, and after that it became 3 years. The gam achar kach elu shel mechatchila pasku es gzar hadin harishon anal lo yishinu es datim. But even after all this time, those who had originally commuted him to death, they didn't change their minds about him. They didn't love him. They didn't hate him any less. Ella shehuchruchu al yidei chugim gevayim yosef b'mshala b'yosem adayim b'tafkidam u'b'tafkam levatel ba'atzmam prat zeh u'l'shachrer es harebi mibeis ha'maiser. It's just that they were forced by people that were higher up than them in the government, to keep giving the Frierdiker Rebbe better conditions. But it's not like he was surrounded by friends. He was surrounded by evil people who hated him and would happily, God forbid, do the worst. The imkain, move on. And so once we understand what the situation was, we understand shahachlota lishar birshusam beveis hamaiser ba'ifin zeh haises akanas nefashas mamash. So then it's clear that he was placing himself in actual danger. So if you're starting to think about last week's Sikha, about the Mekoshesh Eitzim, Ubefrat, and especially, She'etzem siruvay shel harebi linsei b'Shabbos er behem kas noisev v'gadol. So first of all, he's surrounded by people who only wish him the worst, God forbid. So remaining in their clutches for extra hours, for extra days. And now on top of this, he's literally waving that red flag in front of the bull. Because by refusing to travel on Shabbos, he's eliciting a whole new level of anger. Merida keneged pekuda shalahem. First of all, he's rebelling against their commandment. Then, Pirsum shmiras haShabbos beveis hamaisa shelahem ubepirsum hachi godol le'ene hapekidim v'ha'asurim. And then, oh my gosh, to add insult to injury, he's doing this in such a public way. He's promulgating the keeping of Shabbos in their prison, in their Dalet Amas. Like, this is their turf. And he's literally going against them with the greatest type of flagrant disrespect for what they stand for. And he's doing this in a public way in front of everybody that works in this prison and all of the other people that are imprisoned there. The hede yecholtam lahiti lefal as mizimasam ligrem sharebi yisa b'Shabbos. And this is really making them angry because he's not allowing them to actualize their goal and their scheme to make the Rebbe travel on Shabbos. Le'idach, on the other hand, so now, if you're going to think about this from the perspective of logic, the Frierdiker Rebbe is supposed to leave prison on Thursday. So first of all, there's not going to be any Chilul Shabbos because it's Thursday. And Beis rak begedes safek v'kamas svekas. And if it's going to happen that there's going to be Chilul Shabbos later, it's a doubt. In fact, there's a few levels of doubt. Shechein achar hashichrur haya dayim makim rav l'shtadlos b'hanagase shel haRebbe shelo yitzdarich l'nsoyim miyad ba'osei laila. Look how much the Hasidim had already managed to accomplish. They had already managed to take Chalila, commuting to death, and changing that to exile. Then they managed to change the 10 years to 3 years, right? So why shouldn't you think that after the Frierdiker Rebbe comes out, and under his guidance, they will be able to finagle? That he shouldn't have to leave that night, that he shouldn't have to leave immediately after 6 hours. And even if, let's say, you want to say they would not be able to accomplish pushing off his having to leave immediately, there are still 24 hours of the journey until Shabbos begins. So he has 24 hours to try and get the people who are driving, I don't know how he's going, train or whatever it is, whichever means of travel, 24 long hours to change their mind and to have them stop for the duration of Shabbos. And if all else would fail, in the brackets the Rebbe says, and the Frierdiker Rebbe would have to remain in the car of the train. Harehu anus, he's being forced. He has to remain in the car of the train for Shabbos. He's forced into this. It's not something he chose. And it's only an Isser Durabanan. In the footnote, the Rebbe explains, because it's not about the Isser of traveling from a Rishus HaRabim to Rishus HaYachid, because we don't really have a Rishus HaRabim today. It's Isser Tchumin. There's no actual malacha in his being seated in the car of the train. It is Isser of Tchumin, of leaving a certain delineated space during Shabbos, but he's honest, he's forced. V'im kain, and so taking all of this into account, seemingly this is a very great wonder what the Frierdiker Rebbe did here. Why did the Frierdiker Rebbe put himself with such great strength against this travel? And he immediately put himself into a dangerous situation. Seemingly, the first thing he should have done, immediately remove himself from prison, remove himself from the sakana, from the Beis HaAsurim. And afterwards, he's going to figure out a solution that he shouldn't travel on Shabbos, but stay in prison for 2 extra days, 2.5 extra days. Vav. Hanhaga shel mesiras nefesh kazu ra'inu etzel haRebbe b'chol gishasoi la'avoda daharbatzas haTorah v'chizuk hayadot b'medina hi. This type of mesiras nefesh was the hallmark of the Rebbe's work in Russia, in his spreading Torah and strengthening Yiddishkeit. Commotion is bar kama pa'amim, as has been explained many times. Mesiras hanefesh al Rebbe kolala loirak inyanim shechayavim limsar nefesh aleim elagam inyanim shehem begeda harashus biyadai. As has been explained many times, the Rivky's Mesiras Nefesh included not just those things for which halacha mandates that you have to have Mesiras Nefesh, but things that he didn't necessarily. You don't have to have Mesiras Nefesh al pi halacha. Yes, okay, and even more. Kefishin is bar barucha b'makam acher has been explained in a different place at length. Mesiras nafshay hisagam al inyanim shekama gedoyle v'chachme Yisrael savru she'ein limsar nefesh alehem. And even more, the Rebbe says, has been explained at great length in a different place, that the Rebbe's Mesiras Nefesh included things that other great Jewish leaders of the time believed that it was not appropriate. Omnam, kasher nidunhu klolos avodas shel Rebbe b'medina hi yish mokim lahavin madua hi sanagasa ba'ifin kazeh. But the Rebbe says, but still, when you're talking about his work and what the Rebbe accomplished, okay, we could understand. There's place to understand why the Rebbe did what he did. Shekain bir oise shemasa b'nei Yisrael b'medina hi hu kazeh she'etzem hakiyum shel b'nei Yisrael v'shel hayadus oimi b'sakana gedola. Because the Rebbe gave a look and he saw that the very existence of Jews and the ability for there to be any Yiddishkeit was in a tremendous danger. Shelo yichba ner Yisrael chas v'shalom. So it was literally a situation of the flame of the Jews being extinguished, God forbid. Ubahakira yeshluchusay b'tor nasi Yisrael ha'mechuyev lidoy likiyum am Yisrael, and he recognized his shlichus as the nasi Yisrael, that he is obligated to worry and to care for the continuance of Am Yisrael. So when it came to this work, he made no calculation. There were no limitations on his level of Mesiras Nefesh. Aval b'nidun didan, but in what we are discussing now, his remaining in prison for an extra 2.5 days, which was so dangerous. Seemingly, this was not something that he did for the collective, that he was doing for Am Yisrael. Seemingly, this is a private matter. If he should travel on Shabbos, travel to Kostroma, which would include some travel on Shabbos, or not. So why in this case did the Rebbe put himself in such great Mesiras Nefesh? And on the contrary, exclamation point. The Rebbe says, seemingly, it would be the opposite, Cheshman. He shouldn't do this because he's endangering himself. And the Rebbe is not a private person, as Tzippa is pointing out. So he's endangering his whole program. He's endangering his whole shlichus, his whole obligation as a Nasi Yisrael. Zayin. V'yesh loymar hasbara bazeh. Oh, you know what? I think Tzippa might have meant something else. Not that he's not a private person, and by endangering himself, he's endangering his whole program, like the Rebbe says, but rather that he's not a private person, and everything that he does is a model for everybody else, and that is what the Rebbe is going to say in Zayin. And we might say that the explanation is as follows. Hasha'ela ha'emedes ala perek b'nekudas ha'inyan loy ha'isa im yesh limsar nefesh al shmiras ha'shabbos im lav. Lev explains that the question here was not actually, should you have Mesiras Nefesh to keep Shabbos or not? Ela ha'isa zu she'ela shel kiddush Hashem oy chilul Hashem. We spoke very briefly about this last week. But what was really at stake here, what really is the question is, Kiddush Hashem or the opposite. Matarasam shel elu she'asu es harabi, The the indisputed goal of those that imprisoned the Rebbe was for them to destroy his work vis-a-vis strengthening Yiddishkeit. Ilo Yitzuyer Sharebi lo haya misnagid miyad l'pkuda l'ntzayla tekef achar shechruroi kirtzoinoi Sharebi Yisa b'Shabbos haya ze avuram nitzachain Harebi hiskim l'ntzayla b'Shabbos. So once you understand that this whole thing was about destroying his work, which was all about strengthening Yiddishkeit, then you understand that the Frierdiker Rebbe would not have, in the strongest way, stood up against their command or their instruction to him that he travel on Shabbos. That would have been a tremendous victory. You see, we got the Rebbe to travel on Shabbos. Here's the man who's in charge of strengthening and bolstering and developing Yiddishkeit. He and he alone. And we got him to bend. Kol elu shahayu shayim haskamazu. Everybody that would hear at the Frierdiker Rebbe agreed to this. They would not have known everything that was said above. They wouldn't have known that the Frierdiker Rebbe is planning to use the 6 hours to push off travel, or that he would start traveling and he would use the 24 hours before Shabbos to get them to stop. They wouldn't have known all this. That there's going to be all this back channeling and all these secrets, negotiations, in order that the Rebbe shouldn't have to travel on Shabbos. And in the brackets, the Rebbe says, is bar kamepamim. And as has been explained many times, as has been explained many times, when we're talking about Kiddush Hashem and the opposite, then it doesn't matter if the action is the worst action in the Torah or something that doesn't seemingly that important. Hasha'ela hayechida hanagazi ha'im hasoivim alulim lefaresh hasadar b'tech inyan hafri. The only thing you have to concentrate on is how will this be understood by those who are watching, and are they going to take away a negative message, chas v'shalom, something that's opposite Torah mitzvah, something that in some way ekes away at a Kiddush Hashem. Ches. V'zui gam ha'shayches de Gimmel Tammuz leParshas Chukas. And so here is the first of 2 connections that the Rebbe draws between Gimmel Tammuz and Parshas Chukas. First, beParshas Chukas, misupar edes chet mei meriva. In Parshas Chukas, we're told about the chet that's called mei meriva, shebeita of nenshu Moshe v'Aaron, and because of that chet, Moshe and Aaron were punished, ashaloi taviu es hakal hazeh la'aretz, that they would not bring this nation into Eretz Yisrael. U'lechera ein muvan, and seemingly it's not understood. Ma haya chamor kol kach b'chet zeh. What was so terrible about this? Ad shebiglaloi nimna mi Moshe likonis Eretz Yisrael. For this, Moshe was forbidden from going into Eretz Yisrael. Ubefrat, and especially Shari Niskarim, because of Oidin Yanim Shemoshe Nenash Aleim. And especially the Torah tells us other things that Moshe was punished for. Ba'ava Pikain, Loi Nenash Aleim Ba'inish Chamor Kolkach. He wasn't punished so terribly in such a radical and very, very strict way. V'davka chet zeh hashinui lahakois es hasela b'mokim ledaber elav. Davka, this chet, this sin, the difference between hitting the rock instead of speaking to it, hevi l'gzera chamur shelo yikonis l'Eretz Yisrael, this brought about such a terribly strict punishment that he wouldn't go into Eretz Yisrael with the Jews. But the Rebbe says, but the reason is right there alluded to in the pasuk. Ya'an loy he'emanti bi lahakdisheni le'ene b'nei Yisrael. It's all about the optics. It's all about making a Kiddush Hashem in front of all of Bnei Yisrael. Ukeperish Rashi, like Rashi explains, Shemitamze, Chetze, Chamor Yosem, Mitanase Shel Moshe Rabbeinu L'Hashem Hatzayinu Bakar Yishachet Lahem. Rashi explains that this is why this is a worse sin than what happened previously with Bnei Yisrael when they were complaining that they wanted meat, and Moshe Rabbeinu spoke to Hashem, the Hassam, because over there, Lefisha B'Seiser, because Moshe was back channeling with Hashem in private, Chasach Olav HaKasov. So over there's he's given grace. The Khan Shebemamad Kol Yisrael, but here, because it's in front of all of Bnei Yisrael, like Chasach Olav HaKasov, they Kiddush Hashem. But here, there's no mercy, there's no grace, because it happened in front of all of Bnei Yisrael. It's the opposite of a Kiddush Hashem. V'hainu, this means. Shakasher medubar oidis inin shel Kiddush Hashem ha'hafchai, mashenegea ura ketzad hadabar misparish al yidei acherim. When you're talking about an inin of Kiddush Hashem, or the opposite, what matters is how this will be understood, how this will be unpacked by those who see it. Test. And we could say more, going a little bit more deeply. That behavior of the Frierdiker Rebbe, that he, with such strength, stood his ground in opposition to what they told him to do. And these were the people that put him into prison, that wanted to kill him. This expressed itself not only when what was at stake was something that in very manifest fashion had to do with Yiddishkeit. Ella, kefisha siper Rebbe, she'asa heskem chazak ba'atzmai, but as the Frierdiker Rebbe relates, he made a very strong resolution with himself, she'lo yispal mehem klal, that he is not going to be cowed by them at all. Not only in those things that have to do with Torah, mitzvahs, and Yiras Shamayim, he wasn't going to show them that he sees them as an authority and that they have any power over him. And in fact, and he was punished for this. He was flogged. He was beaten for this. So seemingly, this is a Kiddush Hashem. This is not about Kiddush Hashem. And it also doesn't seem to be the case that this kind of behavior would help the Frierdiker Rebbe in spreading Yiddishkeit. So why did the Frierdiker Rebbe do this? So the Rebbe says, you want to know why? This is explained, it's alluded to at the very beginning, in the name of the parsha itself, Chukas, Yud. Rabbeinu Azokin Mevar, Alter Rebbe explains in L'Kutei Torah, Shechuka hu milashon chakika, that Chuka is etymologically rooted in the idea of inscription. Please help me out. The right word is eluding me.
Engraving.
Engraved. Thank you. What is the advantage of engraving overwriting? Because when you write, whatever is written is something that is added. It's an addition to the cloth, to the parchment upon which it is written. and through writing, you join the letters, the words, with the parchment. But here you have two different things that are joined. And because it's inherently two different things, so things can change. It could even be completely abnegated. The letters can be erased from the parchment. In contradistinction, engraving is a whole different thing. When you have letters engraved in something, they're not separate from what they're engraved in. They are one and the same. The letters that are engraved are part of the precious stone in which they are engraved. And therefore it's impossible to separate the letters from the stone. If you touch the letters, you're touching the stone. And it's the same thing spiritually. When serving Hashem is an additional, let's just say, an overlay on the existence of the person, then it's possible for there to be fluctuation in Avodas Hashem. It's possible for there to be differences. It's possible that a person won't do what Hashem wants for whatever reason, including when this person is being forced. And it's possible for him to trespass on a mitzvah or to not do something, and it doesn't change his existence. It doesn't eke away at who he is. But when Avodas Hashem is engraved in his existence, Avodas Hashem nasis chelek mimenu atzmai, the Avodas Hashem becomes him. Azai ein shayach lahafrid oisem Avodas Hashem. Then it's not possible to divide the two. Can't separate them. Netilas inishal Avodas Hashem mimenu peirushay netilas hachravas mitziusay. Taking away Avodas Hashem is destruction of him. It destroys his existence. Al derech shahareitza lahachariv esturas ha'etis shal even tova yizdakik l'shem kach l'shviras even. Just like somebody that wants to destroy the letters that are engraved in a stone, that means they're going to have to destroy the stone. V'lachein, and therefore, mi she'avodas Hashem chakuka b'nafshay. So when you have a person for whom Avodas Hashem is engraved in his soul, moiser nafshay al kol prat uprat shal yadus b'li cheshbonos. So this person is going to sacrifice his life for every detail of Yiddishkeit with no calculation. Because it's not possible to separate him from any inyan in Avodas Hashem. Al derech zeh Yud Aleph Haisa Hanhogas Choik Merichame Admar. This was the Frierdiker Rebbe, my father-in-law's MO. This was how he lived his life. Because everything having to do with Torah mitzvahs was in an ofen of being engraved, it was his existence. It wasn't an aspect thereof. So the whole Inyan Mesiras Nefesh, there was no place for cheshbonos. There was no place to engage in logical let's just say, cost-benefit analysis, ROI, return on investment. There's no place for this at all. Because here you're talking about a situation where this was not about Mesiras Nefesh for something outside of himself. When you're talking about something that's outside of yourself, then there is place to engage in a calculation. Should you have Mesiras Nefesh for this or not? But this wasn't the case here. But this was the default. Mesiras Nefesh was his default. Because serving Hashem was his existence, so much so that it was impossible to separate between him and Avodas Hashem. So then everything in Torah mitzvahs is Mesiras Nefesh. In other words, it's like asking, you're going to have Mesiras Nefesh to find food? Yeah. A person wants to remain alive and they haven't eaten in a week and a half. Yeah, they're going to have to take a risk to find food, to get water, to get oxygen. And for this reason, Mesiras Nefesh loy haisa rak al inyanim shenogu l'avodas b'galoi. And this also explains why his Mesiras Nefesh was not just in things that seemed, in a very revealed way, to have to do with his avodah. Elahu masar nafshe shaloi lihichana le'elu she'asroisei be'eza ofen shehu. But he had Mesiras Nefesh not to subserviate himself to those who imprisoned him in any which way. And the fact that he didn't pay any attention to them, that he gave them no heed, was not something calculated. Ela shebe'etzem loy haya biyecholtoi liyichana be'eza oifen shehu lifnei elu hamafriim umebalbalim lavodas deharbatzas haTorah cholei. It wasn't that he was like, okay, I'm going to engage in this technique. I'm going to chisel away at their authority. I'm going to pay them no heed. No. The Rebbe says it was impossible. It was not possible for him to subserviate himself in any which way to those who seek to thwart efforts in spreading Torah. Because his avodah and habatzas haTorah, because his avodah in spreading Torah, that's who he was. So it wasn't possible for him to subserviate himself in any way to those who sought to impede his work, to stop his work. Tzip was asking, is the Sikh implying that Moshe in some way separated himself from his complete avodas Hashem when he hit the rock? My gut reaction is to say it can't be that that's what the Rebbe is implying here. But I understand your question, and I don't know exactly how to answer it right now. But I am reminded of the fact, and I'm not sure if it's a sikha or somewhere else, that actually this was the biggest level of Mesiras Nefesh on the part of Moshe Rabbeinu.
Correct.
And that he did it to be Mekadesh Shem Shemayim, because all of Bnei Yisrael were watching, and he had in fact spoken to the rock, and the rock did not give forth water, and Hashem had told him to take the staff. Sorry, but I don't have the source in front of me.
There's also I think a medrash that he actually had the Eibishter's back, because he gave the Eibishter an excuse as much as he wanted to go into Eretz Yisrael. gave the Eibishter the excuse that he fulfill his wish, the Eibishter's wish, or the Eibishter's need, or the Eibishter's whatever word you want to put it, that he should not go into Eretz Yisrael. So he gave the Eibishter an excuse. And that's huge, Mesiras Nefesh, having the Eibishter's back like that against his own wish.
And so many sichos where the Rebbe says that this Mesiras Nefesh of the Nasi to stay with his people and not to be separated from them. I wanted to just one thing that really like kind of stood out to me from the Sikha was the end where the Rebbe is saying that you can't separate Avodas Hashem from the Frierdiker Rebbe. You can't. It's no two separate things. So I'm thinking as we're in the days before Gimmel Tammuz, and we start to talk about hiskashrus, the truth of the matter is that hiskashrus can't be an overlay. It can't be a separate thing. It can't be a subject. Oh, now we're going to talk about hiskashrus. We're going to have a farbrengen about hiskashrus. Hiskashrus is not an overlay. Hiskashrus is the definition of a chassid. The only thing we could talk about is in which way is this going to express itself? In which ways can we make it more overt in our homes, with our children, with those around us, for ourselves? But it's not the pshat that it's like, okay, now we're going to sit and we're going to talk about hiskashrus, and that's like a topic for farbrengen. Anyway.
Can I say something?
Everybody can say everything.
What brings to mind is when you're talking about Mesiras Nefesh and what is and what isn't, it reminds me of Hasidim who were on the trains, mamish, going to the camps. And it's time to daven. It's time to daven mincha. You have all these non-Hasidim who are saying, this is spiritual resistance. It's nothing of the kind. It's time to daven mincha. It doesn't matter if you're on a train. It doesn't matter if you're in your shul. It's time to daven mincha. You're a chassid. That's what you do.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Chani, if you don't have your chats open, I'll just read the Chani Shem Tov is saying, isn't there the idea that Moshe hit the rock to be malamed chus for the Yidden? And I think this is Chani Baram saying that the whole idea feels like almost primal in terms of connection, like a mother with her kids. She doesn't think about protecting them. She just protects them because that's what a mother is.
Also, that I find, the last few years, for whatever reason, I've been more involved with people that are not Lubavitch, the literature world, other Chassidim, women, and or not, whatever, men, women, and I find it very interesting that when you learn Chassidus, Tanya, Chassidus, our connection to Eibishter and our connection to doing things are not because we're going to get a bigger Chelek in Olam Haba, or we're gonna whatever it is, the reward that the Eibishter is going to give us. And it's so ingrained in us that when we see that that is the entire focus, we think it's so strange. I think, to me, it seems so strange to me to what extent people will go so they have an extra share in the world to come, without thinking this is a relation to maybe this. I'm doing this for the Eibishter. What's the difference if I burn in hell or don't burn in hell? What's the difference? It has to be done. But in Chassidus, when you learn Tanya, you learn Chassidus, it becomes so much more ingrained in you. And when we have the Rabbeim, see them Mesiras Nefesh, the Rabbeim, our own Rebbe, it just becomes so much part of you that you actually have a taste of it. You actually have also the Chakika in yourself. You understand what I'm? And I think that is also the success of Shluchas. To every person in whatever way they are. You know what I mean? And sometimes it's the craziest circumstances, and you still do it. And it has no seichel. Anyway, so we get it. We get a part of that also in Chassidus and learning, Chassidus Chabad, I should say.
I see it a lot also, and there's a footnote. I don't know if we got to it, but it says Chakik Lashon Chak is above logic. It's like you said, primal. Chak is not a mitzvah that we know why. There's also a book. This reminds me of a book called "The Rabbis Saved by Hitler's Soldiers." It's it's a horrible book, but very accurate, written by someone who doesn't see the Rebbe as a holy man. He just like was a historian, and he was flabbergasted. A Hasidim could read this book and see the Rebbe's Mesiras Nefesh, and he would not bow and he would not cave, and he was taken out of the Holocaust on a cloud of glory, and he insisted on whatever he insisted, and it was gewaldig.
I'm thinking about the Rebbe climbing over the gate at Prospect Park on Rosh Hashanah to do tashlich, where, l'chayra, you could do tashlich in other ways, and you could do tashlich till Yom Kippur, like and the Rebbe wasn't a young lad, a teenager, and this idea that this is who you are, and this is what you are, and this is why you are, and so there's no there's no cheshbonus, there's no, just that's what has to be done.
I want to address what Esther said about different streams of Hasidim not having that consciousness that we do things for the Eibush as opposed to doing things for schar. You have to remember, until the Alter Rebbe came along, that was it's mentioned in the Torah all the time. It's not something that they decided that this is the best way. There's source in Torah for that. So that other Hasidim don't focus on it. It's not their fault. A lot of them really, for me, I struggle with this sort of dichotomy every day because I grew up like that. And when I speak to my classmates who are Satmar, that's how they talk. Everything is framed like that. Schar, everything is about schar. Tznius is about schar. Everything is about just, brownie points. So it's not a chiddush to me. This is how a lot of, from Yidden are being brought up. And it's not necessarily, definitely this is a higher madrega, but it's not, you can't just totally say like, there's no value to it. There's value to it. But, obviously when you do everything for Hashem, that's so much more. And to me personally, it resonates so much more. Like, it's not selfish. It's so much less selfish. But it's not, there's no...
I just want to clarify. My point here was hakika.
Yes. The question is, you're doing a mitzvah in order to get schar. Is that truly a mitzvah l'shem shamayim? If you're doing something with the kavanah to get something out of it, is that a pure mitzvah?
No, I'm not saying that it is. I'm saying it's a level and there's value to it.
I met...
No. I just want to clarify. Since it was addressed to me, I just want to clarify. My point here was hakika.